Okay, what you can see here on the bench now is basically everything that goes into a Tecate motor, with the exception of the clutch cover case and the left-hand center case. Those are drying in the paint booth right now. They've all been stripped and repainted. The right-hand side cover is all ready to go. So the next step is to start fitting the long rod crankshaft into the case and doing the transmission assembly, and then we'll go grab that left-hand center case and put the center cases together. All right, so there's a lot of different ways you can do this. I have 3 aluminum blocks that happen to be the right length that I can set my cases down on. You can do it on a couple of 2x4s, or if you build one of those little wooden assembly, disassembly rigs like I showed in the disassembly video, those work really good for putting this together. Right now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and reassemble everything into this right-hand case half. And that means the crank's going to go in with the crank seals, the main bearings, everything's going to be set in there. Then we're going to put the transmission in complete, make sure it shifts all the way properly. Then we're going to go ahead and assemble the left-hand side cover and torque down the screws. This is a genuine Kawasaki crank seal. We buy the crank seals from Kawasaki because they're genuine and okay. They are the finest quality, and you probably can't see, but this face of the seal is actually made out of Teflon. It's not rubber. If you buy aftermarket gasket sets or aftermarket seal kits, what you're going to get is a seal with a rubber inner lip. This lip, being made out of Teflon, is nice and sharp, and it doesn't wear down over time, and it isn't degraded by ethanol fuels or race gas or most of the octane boosters. So we always use genuine Kawasaki crank seals when we assemble a motor here. Start out by putting a little bit of grease on the outside of the seal. Just gently wipe that around. That's going to do a couple things. Number one, it's going to ease how well it goes into the case, and it's also going to make this rubber on the outside of the seal stay soft. So over time, you're not going to have seal degradation. Then we're going to put a little bit of lube inside of it, not much, just a tiny bit to make sure everything's nice and slick during assembly. Then we're going to set it down in the case, and we're just going to push it into place. So we're going to take the seal driver, we're going to set it in there over the seal, and all we're going to do is push down on it and rock it back and forth and gently push it all the way down until it doesn't go any farther. You notice that it sits all the way down. There's 2 steps in here. This step back here is for the crank to stop at. This step down here is for the seal to stop at. And the reason there's 2 steps is because you want the bearing to stop here and you don't want the bearing to ride on the seal. The other thing that you always want to check is to make sure that the seal went all the way down against the case on the back side. So when you're looking at the case from the back side, there shouldn't be any gap between the lip on the case right here and the seal itself all the way around. Once you have that set up and good and tight, you know the seal's in place where it needs to be, and we are ready to drop a crankshaft in. So once again, we're going to put a little bit of grease in the area, the install area. It's going to do a couple things for us. Again, it's going to make sure that everything slides together well when we assemble it, and it's going to protect it over time to make sure that nothing gets corroded or jammed in place, so that if we ever have to rebuild this motor again, it's going to come apart real nice. In this motor, we're installing an 8mm long rod crankshaft. A longer rod does not increase the stroke of the motor. It doesn't make the motor any bigger in displacement. It simply lengthens the distance between the top bearing and the bottom bearing on the rod, which gives us a better rod angle during the power stroke, and consequently gives us a bit more torque. and a little bit more dwell time at top dead center, and that equates to more torque and more acceleration. So let's go ahead and assemble that crankshaft. We're going to do this probably differently than you've seen on most other videos on the internet. This is not going to go in with a press. It's not going to go in with some kind of a fancy puller or something that you don't have readily available. This is going to go together. It's going to drop right in. It's not going to take any pounding, so let's get to it. The bore in the case is about 2/1000 of an inch smaller than the outside diameter of the main bearing that it's going to go in. So that's what we refer to as a press fit or an interference fit. What we want to do is make sure that the crank will drop right in here without any force or any pullers. So we're going to do that by heating up the case. That's going to make the case expand about 3 or 4/1000 of an inch. That's going to allow the crank to drop right in there, and we're not going to have to use any force or any special puller. We're just going to do that with a propane torch. It's important to keep the propane torch out here around the outside edge. You're trying to make it expand out here, but you don't want to burn the crank seal. So it takes a couple of minutes, and you're going to try and heat it up to about 200, 225 degrees. If you only heat it up to about 150 degrees, that works too, but 200, 225 gives you a little extra working time. All right, we want to make sure we have the crank in the right direction. We're simply going to hold the rod up there, and the crank falls right in the case. That's it. That's all there is to it. That crank is now seated in the case. We're going to give it about a minute to cool off, and you'll notice that already the crank won't come out of the case. If I lift up on it, I'm going to pull the case right off. That's it. Crank's in. Now that we have the crank installed, I can make sure it rolls through real nice. It's in there seated real good. We'll go ahead and install the transmission. We're going to install the transmission very much the same way that we took it out in the previous video. We're going to take the main shaft and the counter shaft. We're going to mate the two together so that they fit real nice. And we're simply going to just take the two of them and set them down in until they fall right in. Now remember this little washer that we found in the case last time? You need to make sure that little washer gets right here. Otherwise this gear will move up and down, and the gear behind it will move up and down, and you'll get a bad shift. The next thing to do is we're going to install the shift drum. Shift drum's only going to go in one way. It'll be pretty obvious. Then we're going to start out with the smallest of the three shift forks. That shift fork is the forward shift fork. We're going to slide it in to the gear. Then we're going to line it with the groove in the shift drum. Then we're going to take the shorter of the two pins. Make sure there's nothing on them. Got a little debris there. All right. And we're simply going to slip that pin in. Now you're going to have two shift forks left over. They're about the same width, but the offset on the pin is different. So these two shift forks are going to go in so that the pins are closer together. You want to make sure that the pins are not farther apart. You want to make sure they're together. So this one's going to go in first, and this is the one marked number 59, and the top one is marked number 58. So we're going to put number 59 in first. We're simply going to slip it down in just like we did onto the gear. We're going to line it up, we're going to lift it up until it lines up with the groove. Now we're going to take shift fork number 58. We're going to set it in there and line it up. Line it up with the groove. And we're going to install the pin. Okay, now that we have all the shift forks in, you can see the transmission spins freely, where before we put the shift forks in, we could only rotate it a certain distance before it wanted to jam up. Now we're going to make sure all the gears work properly. We're going to spin the transmission. The transmission will only shift while it's being rotated. And we're going to take the shift drum and we're going to turn it clockwise when we're looking at it as far as it'll go. And that's first gear. So this is first gear. Now we're going to shift to second gear. And as we rotate the shift drum counterclockwise, we go to third gear. We're going to shift to fourth gear. We're going to shift to fifth gear. And finally, we're going to shift to sixth gear. And the shift drum won't rotate anymore. So now we know that it goes through all the shifts. We're going to go ahead and spin it back the other way while we rotate it until we're all the way back to first gear. And we're going to leave it in first gear while we put it back together. It doesn't matter what gear it's in when you put it back together. Just make sure it shifts properly and it goes through all the gears. So you remember there was no shim on here. There's a little lip on here. And this is going to be pulled up to the bearing by the sleeve and the circlip for the sprocket. This one has the thrust washer that came back out of it. So the cases are ready to go back together. The first thing we're going to do is find the two 8mm dowel pins. The dowel pins are going to have a beveled edge and they're going to have a square sharp edge. We want to make sure that the sharp edge goes down in this case, and they're simply going to press down. There's going to be one in the front, one in the back. I'm going to just gently tap on them to make sure they're seated so that we know that they're going to line up. We put the pointed or the beveled end upwards so that as we're setting the case down, it'll guide the case down until the bearing bores are all lined up, and the side cover will go back. And the side cover will go back on. Right, with the dowel pins in, we're ready to put case sealer on. I've gone ahead and installed the crank seal into the case, just like we did on the other one. We put a little bit of grease around the back side of it and pushed it down in there so it's in. One of the things to keep in mind is the right hand and left hand crank seals are the only two seals that need to be in before you assemble the case. You cannot put the crank seals in after you assemble the case, but you don't need the shift shaft seal, the transmission shaft seal. You don't need any of those seals in place yet. We're going to put all them in later. Right now we just have the left and right hand crank seals, and we're going to go ahead and put some adhesive on here and put it back together. So I like to use anaerobic crank case sealers. My preference is this Loctite 515. If I don't use the Loctite 515, sometimes I'll use the 3-Bond 1211. The 3-Bond 1211 is a silicone-based sealer. It's good if the cases have been gouged up real bad. You have a lot of areas that you have to seal, grooves, scratches, things like that. It's also a little bit more flexible. Just keep in mind that anything that you decide to use should be a sealant recommended for sealing two-stroke cases together, because remember, everything from here all the way up to here is going to be exposed to whatever fuel you're going to be running in your motor. That could be gasoline with ethanol in it. By itself, ethanol will rarely ever bother any of the sealants. However, race gas has things like acetone and toluene in it, which will definitely attack a lot of the lower quality sealers that are out there, and you want to make sure that you're not going to have a leak later on. The rest of the case, all the way around here and all the way around here, they're going to only be exposed to regular transmission oil or motor oil, depending on what you use in your transmission, and so most any sealer will work there. However, make sure you use a good two-stroke sealer. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a small amount of the Loctite 515 all the way around. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and drop this right on like we did the other side, and it's going to set right down on. That easy. Now while it's still warm, we're going to go ahead and drop our case bolts in, tighten it all down. So with the case bolts, we want to start in the center and work both directions. Remember, these 3 bolts we can't tighten down until we put the cover on, but we're going to go ahead and take care of this one. So we're going to work our way back and forth. So okay, all the case bolts are good and tight. The crank is installed. Now, just like we did when we took it apart, the next thing we're going to want to go ahead and do is put in the counterbalancer bearing support cover. That's going to give us the last 3 bolts that hold the case tight. All right, with this cover, you can see that it says up right there. Up is towards the base of the cylinder, of course. So we're going to go ahead and just set this in there with that facing upwards. We can go ahead and drop our bolts in there. But what we're going to want to do is, before we tighten anything down, we're going to want to make sure this is pushed all the way down. Because if we tighten any of these down and the cover cocks just a little bit while we're doing that, we'll snap off one of the ears. But now that we have it all the way down, we're going to go ahead and torque those 3 bolts down. All right, all the bolts are tight. We're going to give it about 15 minutes for the anaerobic sealer to cure, and then we're going to start putting the seals on this side, then flip it over, and we're going to start assembling the other side. Okay, it's been about 15 minutes since we torqued everything down. We're going to go ahead and put the seal in for the countershaft sprocket, and for the shift shaft, well, we have this side up. The only seal that I don't use that's genuine Kawasaki is this seal. That is the sprocket seal. Anybody who's owned Tecates for any length of time knows that they're notorious for leaking around the sprocket. They leak transmission fluid around there. Doesn't really hurt anything, but it makes a big mess and it doesn't need to leak. This again is also an NOK seal, but it's a seal for a KX250. Where the original seal is all metal on the outside and it just has a rubber lip on the inside. This is just like the crank seals. This has an embedded Teflon seal on the inside of it, so we get a lot more wear life, and we don't get the dirt and the mud and things making it past the Teflon seal that we did on the rubber seal. We're going to do the same thing on this one that we did on the rest. We're going to put a little bit of lube around the outside. We're going to go ahead and tap it in with a seal driver. So, small amount of grease on the outside of it. Again, the grease is just to make sure that we don't damage anything putting it in, to help it go in, and it's also going to keep the rubber good and flexible. We're just going to put a small amount of grease on the inside of here just to make sure it has lubrication. Then we're simply going to put a seal driver on there. And it is in. Alright, the next seal we're going to put in is the seal for the shift shaft. Same drill, a little grease on the outside, a little grease on the inside. And we're going to go ahead and put it in.
If you worked in aircraft manufacturing or aircraft painting at Boeing, semiconductor or printed circuit board manufacturing, or other industries where hazardous chemicals or solvents were used, your children may be entitled to legal damages. Birth defects have been linked to toxic chemicals and solvents used in these industries. If your child is born with brain or spinal cord damage, organ or limb deformities, blindness,
You only need to push it in flush. You can drive it down in a little bit farther if you want to, but as long as it's flush on the outside, you are good. One of the things that I really like about anaerobic sealers is, by their very nature, anaerobics only cure with the absence of oxygen. So they don't cure until you put the parts together. So they're kind of like super glue, where if you just put it on, it just sits there as a liquid, and once you put it together, then it begins to cure. So this set of cases has been sitting here on the bench for 2 days. I know that all the sealer's good and hard where it's clamped together. However, I have areas here where some of the squeeze out has leaked out, and I want to clean that up so it looks good. Because it doesn't harden unless it's put together or squeezed together, I can simply take a rag or a paper towel and very carefully just wipe it, and any of the uncured sealant wipes right up. So I don't have a bunch of silicone or anything that I have to clean up later, and it looks really good once I get it cleaned up. The other thing that's kind of nice is that when you forget to put the tube, or when you forget to put the cap on the top of the tube, because it's anaerobic, it never hardens up. It's ready to go whether you put the cap on it or not. It will not cure until you put the parts together. So you can literally put the sealant on the case halves and go away and have lunch for a couple of hours and come back, and it's still ready to put together when you get back. So the anaerobic sealers are kind of nice in that aspect. They cure, they're very flexible, they're very heat resistant. So that's why I use them a lot. All right, so now that our center cases are together, you can see that I'm literally just going to grab hold of this crankshaft and spin it with my fingers. Since I put the crank in the cases using heat, I didn't have to pull anything, push anything, no presses, no special pullers, and by doing that, there's no load on anything. The crank is in a neutral position. It's right in the center where it needs to be. There's no stress on the bearings whatsoever. So my break-in is going to be, my bottom end break-in is going to be virtually nothing, because there's no load, there's no seating of anything. Plus, I have a lot less friction when I turn it over. I mean, both my crank seals are in right now. Both my brand new main bearings are in. It's a brand new crank, but you can see there's almost no load to turn it over. And that's what we want, because anything that takes pressure to turn the crank, that takes away from horsepower through our wheels. So now that we have the center cases back together, just for convenience, I'm going to go ahead and put it back in the engine stand, because it holds it to the right height, gives me the ability to flip it around. However, if you don't have an engine stand and some fixturing for the engine stand, you can literally just turn this on its side and go ahead and assemble the rest of what we're going to do. So next part is putting the clutch and the kickstarter together.